Sego, it is April 6th, 2018. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people with look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and a look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network. Streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation and simulcast and rebroadcast on the Gwe at CKWE in Tandanega. You can find us streaming our audio at www.ltnradionet.com. And of course, we are streaming live with video here on Facebook Live. And I will look for your comments, especially during our breaks. Any comments that you may have to the subject matter. And let me get right into it. Let me tell you what we want to talk about here. I was a part of a discussion, actually just last night, coming back from New York. I participated in a roundtable discussion. I do it once a week with various activists from representing different peoples, indigenous peoples, black people, and it's an event that I usually participate in like every week. And the topic that was talked about was how do we use our ancestors' teachings going today? And whatever that means. And kind of the direction that I took the conversation, I want to thank Nolan Hack and some of the other folks who participated in that discussion. But I think where it comes down to is understanding some of the things that our ancestors did were culturally appropriate, and some of them weren't. And so the question is, what do we bring forward from those who came before us? I mean, what is it? If we look back at our ancestors, and of course, if you look deep back and you understand, language origin and concepts and expressions and that kind of thing, you can get a strong sense for what people were thinking a very, very long time ago. But if you just look at what your parents or your grandparents or what the people who basically had impact on your life, what they have done, you may find that some of the things that you have counted as culturally appropriate or tradition, as they say, may not have been tradition at all. And I think the question ends up being, what is it? How do we parse the difference between what our ancestors were doing that was appropriate to the path that made us distinct and autonomous and protected our sovereignty and that kind of stuff, versus the decisions that they perhaps had to make based on necessity, on survival, on decisions that perhaps were right for the moment. And I'm not suggesting that they were a complete abandonment of this concept of making decisions that with attention to the 7 generations that would come later. I'm not suggesting that per se. But on a daily basis, we sometimes have to make decisions, that are either right for the moment or, right for our family or make, frankly, decisions that may come at the cost of something that in retrospect wasn't worth the cost. And so I guess this is a discussion. Clearly, we can look back at those that came before us and look many generations back. There's a lot documented in history. Treaties that I would argue are not very good, decisions that we could argue were forced upon our people. They were either coerced or forced assimilation, I guess, is another example of that. But again, I think when we look back and we try to analyze what is the path. What is our path? When we talk about Guyana or Goa, we know that word means a great good path, and that path was laid down with parameters and processes to help us resolve conflict. But we could argue, if we look back at our history, how far back do you have to go to where we weren't being influenced unduly by colonists, by European influence, by the influence of what would ultimately become a world superpower. And I think if you take an honest look at that, you really have to begin that process of parsing out what were the activities of our ancestors or those that came before us that were consistent with our culture and really should have been the path that led us in a direction. So when it was our turn to make, to use our feet to form that path going forward, that we didn't take a turn to the right or a turn to the left, that we stayed on a natural path of evolutionary development and progress, I would say, as a people. So having said all that, and I know that sounds like a lot of big words and that kind of stuff, so let me explain, I guess, what I think is the distinction between what our ancestors, what those teachings really were about, and what I think that they meant to instill in future generations and try to establish as the cultural norms, versus some of the decisions that were made for the moment, made for survival, made for to get them through another day, or in many ways maybe get the next generation through another day. All right, so one of the things that we oftentimes when people look at Native people and they try to understand our culture, there ends up being this discussion about, I love Native spirituality. You get a whole lot of New Agers, and this came out of the '60s and the '70s and the hippie movement, and everybody fell in love with Indians, and they fell in love with this notion of what we are. I mean, and that's often tied even to the mascot issue. People have this sense for what a Native person was, and they come up with these pan-Indian, images or stereotypes of what Native people are, and people want to embrace it. Do you know how many dream catchers you'll see in the possession of people who think that, in fact, I just saw, I got to tell you, I saw a video posted of some woman who was, overdosing from heroin. And as they were pulling her out of her car, there's a dream catcher hanging in her car. White woman, no Native connection, but there's a dream catcher hanging from her rearview mirror. And I saw somebody commenting, "What the heck's a dream catcher doing there?" Well, that's that notion of it would be great to say that it was of acceptance or compassion or understanding or affinity to Native people, but sometimes it's not quite that clear. So there is that whole sense where people became enamored with the sense of Native spirituality, and of course, when you talk of spirituality, there's that line between, for some anyway, between spirituality and religion. And in fact, even if you listen to one of the greatest speeches spoken by Red Jacket, when he was blocking missionaries from setting up in Seneca territory, one of the things that he said, and keep in mind when he said this is before the Code of Handsome Lake and Gariwio and all that. But what he said is, why would we want your religion when we have our own? So he was already using the word religion as a sense for our knowledge base and our culture. And I don't even want to call it our belief system, because I think we get into that conversation about the difference between beliefs and knowledge. Beliefs are the things that you're told. Knowledge is what you experience. And I think oftentimes we use teachers and we use the enlightened ones to prepare people to receive knowledge, but not necessarily fill their heads. That's where, again, the difference between religion and open-mindedness or religion and I guess an openness to the powers of creation directly. I mean, religion is a device that creates conformity. It creates hierarchy. It creates, it stifles critical thinking and creativity. That's what religion does. And part of it is again to encourage conformity, encourage a certain standard of behavior, and frankly, encourage a certain standard of thought. So when I look at uh, what our ancestors would have intended for us to do, is not just to package up our knowledge base, our culture, in the stories and ceremonies or behaviors, practices, or whatever. Not package it up so we could like lay it down side by side against religion in kind of the way that Red Jacket did. And I don't think Red Jacket meant to do it that way. He was just using a word that they would understand. This was a speech to them, not a speech to us. It wasn't advocating that our way of life was a quote unquote native religion. So I think sometimes things get taken out of context. But the difference was our culture, including our ceremonies, including the Uhunda Gariwatekwa, the Ganunyo. I mean, all of these things are about acknowledgement of nature and creation. And what was advocated most strongly by what I would think are the wisdom of those elders and those wise elders was the notion of critical thinking. And this was part of the conversation I had last night with the group that I was discussing with. This notion of critical thinking and utilizing intelligence. It's one of the things that my friend Degarundege talks about. That we have a brain, that the power that we have been given isn't just physical power. That power of thought and reason allows us to have critical thinking. It's really kind of one of the things that perhaps separates us from other parts of creation. I'm not saying it puts us above them, but it certainly gives us a different way to have innovative ways to solve problems. So if I want to embrace the things that my ancestors laid down as a path that they were on, I have to acknowledge that they were intelligent, that they were creative, that they applied critical thinking that certainly fit within the laws of nature. And if there are any laws that are worthy of mention, I would say the laws of nature are. And I'll give some specific examples. One of the things that I think is one of the most amazing things that I learned over the last few years was not just that our people developed corn as a staple, of our food supply. Not that they essentially genetically modified, what was a grass into what would ultimately be the many, many varieties of corn. Certain corns that were drought resistant in the Southwest, frost resistant up here in the Northeast. I mean, all these different varieties of corn, and a corn that had characteristics that allowed it to be in abundance in various climates and various regions, and held different values within different people. We as Haudenosaunee, as Ongwe, we oftentimes refer to the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. And we talk about these being a plant that we nurtured like our children, like our daughters, until they would become mature and then support our health and well-being. But the other thing isn't just about that our people had this incredible mental capacity to take certain crops and use the best seed corn or seed, I guess, from whatever it was, corn, beans, or squash, or other different varieties of plants that we farmed, and improve them, and not just improve the corn itself, but one of the amazing things that I learned from Jane Mount Pleasant from Cornell. She said the way in which we processed corn, and we would use wood ash, to soften the hulls to separate, so we could get the white, corn, the meat of the corn out of the hulls. And the fact that we used wood ash to do it didn't just, as opposed to just directly lye or what sometimes people use today, it didn't just soften the hulls and, so we could separate them and, of course, make corn mash and corn flour and all that other stuff. It did something more than that. It actually added nutrition to the corn. What corn didn't have by itself, growing in a stalk or on a cob, was niacin. So when I mean, for me to even wrap my head around the fact that we used a process for corn that made it better for us, made it more nutritious for us, is incredible. And we could debate, well, was it just an accident? I don't know. And of course, there are plenty of people who would suggest that there was some sort of divine intervention. I don't necessarily go there with that. I mean, I hear people say that about our language, about lacrosse being the creator's game, that it was given to us by by the spirits, or that our language was somehow handed down. Look, that's not my belief system. I have faith in those ancestors that came before us, that they were an intelligent, thought-provoking, problem-solving, critical thinking people. And to me, that is what I want to embrace, and that's what I want to learn more about. So when I learn that that corn wasn't just something that grew naturally, that it needed the hand of man, our people. I don't mean man as in man versus woman, but that it needed the hand. Actually, more directly, it did need the hand of our women to make it what it was. And then it took the hands of our women to utilize the process of using wood ash to to break the hulls off of the corn. I mean, so I think about this stuff, and what an incredible accomplishment. And of course there are many beyond that. I mean, there's a lot of problem solving that our people took into account in everything from the way we hunted and gathered and farmed, where we chose to live, the structures that we built, and and there's and then of course beyond the technological, and yes, there were. I mean, there were technological advances that our people had. People oftentimes think, well, the Europeans had all the technology and we had what? Corn? No, we had technology, but the other thing that we had was a better and a greater and a deeper understanding of humanity and the role that human beings should play in the natural order of, or not even want to use order, but the natural relationship of creation. We had moved away, and oftentimes even when we had our own challenges for things like power and violence or war or bloodshed or whatever it was, we persevered above that, and we took a conscious effort to avoid creating hierarchies amongst our people. So when you think about Europeans coming upon us and seeing a social system, a cultural system that did not have hierarchies, didn't have kings and queens and a royal progression or whatever you want to call it, order for maintaining order and maintaining control over people, and that the European model was about maintaining order and keeping social order, law and order, all that stuff, rule of law. And yet we had social order. Our lives weren't chaos, and we did it without armies, without jails, without judges, without kings and queens. And that was an evidence of an evolved people, not a primitive people, not a people who couldn't have put together those kind of those hierarchies, but a people who had evolved past that. I mean, obviously, when you think about nature, you do have the alpha male within certain animal societies that that has plays a dominant lead or whatever else. But as a species that was different, that had the power of reason and problem solving and critical thinking, we moved beyond that. The Europeans hadn't done that yet. They hadn't evolved to a place where equality had persevered. They were still living in almost that caveman mentality of creating, might makes right. So that is, to me, what I want to embrace from our ancestors. Now, we can get into a completely different discussion about things that our ancestors did that oftentimes we could label them as mistakes, but they also may have been the means to cope with the circumstance. And again, we're not in the same set of moccasins or shoes that those that came before us were. So when I think about how alcohol, I mean, there's no question that I don't think any ancestors of ours planned on embedding alcohol in our cultural path that would be with us for 7 generations. But it certainly was, and it certainly has been, and it certainly is. So I would have to say that was something that those that came before us did that was not consistent with our culture. And frankly, maybe it was a coping mechanism. It was a way to alleviate in much the same way that people look at the substance abuse issues that exist today, and the fact that we have cocaine and heroin problems and all kinds of other substance abuse problems, and it's the way that people get through their adversity, their depression, and that kind of stuff. So there was that. Residential schools. We had plenty of parents that willingly gave up their kids to those residential schools. So as I continue to work on what I hope ultimately will be, my first book, which is Lies My Ancestors Told Me, which is the title that I got from my friend Sugar Montour. Lies My Ancestors Told Me, The Cognitive Dissonance of Assimilation. That's what the book plans to do. It plans to separate those issues related to some of the behaviors of our ancestors that were wrong, that took on a sense of directing that path for many generations, including the generation that exists currently. That probably wasn't intended, but nobody ever bothered to separate that thing. I think religion is another one of those examples. The fact that we had so many people that embraced religion, perhaps as a means to survival. And I say that literally because, when I listen to the Tuscarora stories, we're told that the Tuscarora were told either you convert or you die. And certainly that wasn't the only people who faced that. Now, whether our people face that or not, I mean, when you hear Red Jacket rejecting these missionaries, setting up shop in Seneca territory, clearly we had a choice in that matter. But you know what? That influence comes in. And then what you use is not only this idea that white supremacy is tied to religion, and then that's the way you sell it as a bill of goods to other people of color who will never enjoy that same privilege, that white privilege that came from the Christian nations of Europe. But you dangle it out there. You say, well, it's tied to Christianity. That's how you become a superior creature. And that's the way it was. And of course, you also mix that in with things like disease and medicine. So this whole idea of using like smallpox and other diseases that perhaps white man did have some cures for because they were disease ridden for centuries before they came to our shores. So you tie this idea of how you treat disease with religion. And all of that. So, I mean, so that's how you can imagine how our people got coerced into it or in many ways forced into it. So that's an example. I don't think that our ancestors intended for all of us to abandon our knowledge base and pick up religion, again, with all of the constraints that come with it, all of the denials that religion incorporates, the idea of rejecting certain things and the idea of creating that good versus evil construct that the major religions of the world still are bound to. In our culture, I don't think that, even as the creation story, which gets manipulated that it says the left-handed twin was evil and the right-handed twin was good. Well, what a coincidence! What a coincidence that you have this notion of left and right, one being bad, left being bad, and right being good. You know what the Latin words for left and right are? The Latin word for left is sinister, spelled just like sinister. A coincidence? I don't think so. The Latin word for right, like right-handed or the right side of something, is dexter. Like dexterity is a good thing, right? So you have sinister on the left, and you have dexterity or dexter on the right. So again, those are the influences that I don't think our ancestors intended for us to take in hook, line, and sinker. And there are others. Look, I know that our people picked up weapons to fight alongside, in Revolutionary War and Civil War and world wars and that kind of stuff. But I still think that a lot of that stuff was done out of necessity, out of a sense of survival. I mean, the reason you have Native people and people of color enlisting at high rates is because, frankly, there aren't a whole lot of other opportunities. And I think our people, as well as black people, looked at the military as militaries as or military service as a place that they could enlist and not be subject to the same racism that they would see in American society. But when I hear somebody, a Native person, say, "Well, I come from a family of 3 generations of Marines, or Navy or Army or Air Force or whatever," it gets back to the whole thing. So that's what you're calling your tradition, but is it really? Why did your great-grandfather or your great-great-grandfather or your great-great-great-grandfather stand side by side with Americans or whomever, Canadians, if you will? Was it because they embraced this military-industrial complex that the white Christian nations of Europe were advocating, or was it out of necessity? Was it the intention to begin a tradition that we would pass on generation after generation, expecting our kids to serve in the armed forces? I don't think so. They made their decisions perhaps for a whole different set of reasons than when we do it today. Now, we see Native people embracing this whole idea of American patriotism and all of that. Look, we're at the bottom of the hour. We'll take a break, but this is the conversation that I think we need to have. I think we need to begin the process of understanding the difference between what is our culture and what has been assimilation and what has now created what I call cognitive dissonance, the cognitive dissonance of assimilation. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. I'll be right back.
Hero, lost alive today. Folks try their best, but sometimes it's just hard to explain. Stripped away from a lover's arms, carried off on the wings of love, and I'll be waiting to see your face again. I'll be waiting, oh, waiting, yeah. Though I didn't have a chance to say goodbye, I'll say hello in the afterlife, just like the first time we met. Sometimes I wish on a falling star, and I wonder how high up you are. Thinking to myself, oh, it feels so nice to believe
Thanks for coming back. Hey, I decided we're going to play just some of the Native women, the music from Native women that is among some of my favorite music. We opened up with Jennifer Kreitzberg, one of the songs from her CD, the CD that she gave to me when I ran into her when she was performing with Eulalie up in Akwesasne a couple of years ago, and then we just played a track from Darkwater Rising, Charlie Lowry and Company, just now, and again, these are some great women. In fact, Charlie and Jennifer performed together. Charlie sits in with Eulalie, with Pure Fay, and some of the others from down in Tuscarora territory, and these I got to tell you, these women are some of the best vocalists and musicians, artists that I've had the pleasure to listen to. So I don't have a whole lot of women on this show, so at very least I can play music from some of the Native women, and this is one of the things that I hope to do more with. I hope to look. We have a studio here. I guess I got to do more outreach and get some folks in here, and we have multiple mics, so we can put some people in here. We had a couple of friends in here last a couple of weeks ago with Paul Delarone, James Gray, and of course Matt Hill was in studio with us. And I do have the means to have people join me by phone. They simply plugged into my cell phone, but it does work, and I think we need to do more of that. And I do need to use this platform, this show, to introduce guests and a broader conversation into what we're doing here. Before I get back into the subject matter that I began the show with, I do want to thank my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White in ERW Enterprises, and of course individuals, friends that make contributions on a fairly regular basis. Guys like Ed Schindler and Cynthia Trice, Neville Spring. Look, one of the other companies, and I guess I should move that on my list here, that I've got to give a note to is Legacy 420 in Tandanega. They are now one of the businesses that have stepped up to do some ongoing support for the program, and I appreciate that. And of course, this program is different than many others, so I appreciate all of you who not only support the program today, but have supported in the past. And we used to be on commercial radio, and we had ads that ran and had a different process of sponsoring the programs, and we had to raise a lot more money because we were paying for that airtime. And I couldn't be here today, approaching my 8th year, if I didn't have the support that that got us here. So all of you who even have supported in the past, I want to thank all of you. Look, I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. I want to thank CKWE for both their simulcast and their rebroadcast, as well as Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio. Those are internet radio networks that carry the program. And and I also want to thank all of you who share the show. So that includes my wife, who shares the program, the Facebook Live program on many other group pages. Folks like Donna Van Boyle, who share this show and my show in New York as well. Toby Sid John and others who are sharing the program. I thank all of you. That's the way we get the word out. And again, look, the stuff that I'm talking about here today, especially when I get into religion and military service, I know a whole lot of people can take offense to that. But look, I'm trying to put it into perspective. I think there are many reasons for people to deviate, what I would say, from a path of autonomy and distinction and sovereignty, and oftentimes that deviation is made out of necessity, or what is a perceived necessity anyway. Survival. Sometimes we make decisions that we think are the best decision we can make for that moment. In retrospect, it may not have appeared to be, but again, in retrospect, we're trying to evaluate a decision that was made by people a long time ago in a completely different circumstance than the one that we're currently in. So I hesitate to necessarily condemn our ancestors or those that came before us, However, I do, again, as I said at the beginning of the show, I think it's important to understand what they retained and the path, the cultural path that they really intended to maintain for us to have some of that distinction, autonomy, and elements of our sovereignty versus decisions that they made that were made for the moment. And I know that's different. That's difficult because when we have a tendency to pick up habits that we call traditions. And again, the story that is often told, and I first heard it from Neville Spring. He told me the story about his wife cutting a roast in half to prepare it for a big family dinner, and one of the daughters asking, "Why do you cut the roast in half?" Well, that's the way my mother always did this. So then they asked the grandmother, well, why do you cut the roast in half, to prepare it for dinner? And she said, well, that's the way my mother did it. And she said, but why did she do it that way? And as it turns out, the great grandmother, I guess, or great grandmother, did it because she didn't have a big enough pot to cook the roast in. But it becomes a tradition. It becomes the manner in which you do something. It's kind of like following a recipe and never being quite sure what why you do certain things a certain way, why certain ingredients. You may find out that part of the reason that the recipe exists the way it is was because of poverty that existed during a certain time of somebody's life. That we use certain things, to prepare food in a certain way, not because it was the choice that we made, because we didn't have choices. I mean, when you think about what many people call soul food, a lot of what became part of that traditional black diet was born out of just what people could eat. Out of the life of slavery and oppression under very greedy and oppressive plantation owners. Now I'm not saying we still shouldn't keep some of that. I mean, one of the things we talk about roast corn soup. Most people don't realize that this idea of roast corn soup, we learned once they burned our corn stores that removing the hulls it could be done a different way other than soaking it in wood ash. By parching, the corn, it would make the hulls, once you soak them after parching, fall off in the same way. So this idea of roast corn soup, that was born out of necessity, out of us utilizing what was left of what was a genocidal act by George Washington's men. This idea, and not just George Washington's men. The French did it before the Americans did. Tried to destroy our food stores. So roast corn soup, which again, folks up in Mohawk territory weren't as necessarily familiar with it. I tell a joke sometimes about some of the guys coming down from Akwesasne and having roast corn soup for the first time and said, "Oh, I can tell such and such was involved in cooking this because they burnt it," and not realizing that the corn was prepared as roast corn, not as hull corn or as washed corn, the way we would do it with wood ash. So, but that roast corn soup, as much as many of us look at it as as a part of our ancient traditions, it isn't so much an ancient tradition. It's a tradition we picked up basically out of necessity, so we didn't starve from having white men trying to destroy our food supply. Now, it's a perfectly reasonable way to separate the hulls from corn, but it was born out of necessity. So, I mean, I think there are things like that you can pick up as a part of your tradition that are not a deteriorating factor to our culture. But then when you look at other things that we may pick up, again, displaced loyalty. Like I said, you drive through our territories and you're going to see a hell of a lot more American flags than even Seneca Nation flags, and certainly not the flags you'll see beside you. You're not going to see a whole lot of flags of the Truro Wampum, a whole lot of flags of the Unity flag, but you're going to see lots of American flags. So this displaced patriotism, which some people got from their parents, who got from their parents, and got from their parents, don't understand, well, what was the necessity there? It makes me think of a line of a song. There was a song called Silent Running by Mike and the Mechanics. If you're an 80s guy, you might know the song. But there's a line that says, teach your children quietly, because someday some sons and daughters will rise up and fight where we stood still. I mean, there's a line in the song that says, pledge allegiance to their flag, whatever flag they offer. Never let them know what you truly feel. I mean, and that resonates with me, because I think about, what our people had to do to survive. And the certain level of, I don't want to even say indoctrination, because I don't know if it was truly indoctrination or if it was just kind of going along to get along. So we would survive. Look, the one thing I can't deny about our ancestors and those that came before us is that we're still here fighting for our distinction. So they obviously retained enough in not just surviving, but in instilling that sense of distinction and identity, native identity. Some of it's cloudy. Some of it is obscured. And some of it has been twisted by, I mean, look, we've got a lot more churches on any given native territory than we do longhouses. We have a lot more churches that serve the function of community centers than community centers that are not necessarily tied to religious beliefs. So, and I'm not advocating the destruction or the removal of churches. I'm not doing it, but I'm trying to put things in a perspective. And again, we do an annual powwow here in Seneca Territory, or I would say I don't want to claim ownership or responsibility, but a powwow is done in Allegheny, and like many powwows across the U.S. and perhaps even in Canada, I'm not sure, they get designated veterans powwows. So they honor the military service of not just the current generation, but the generations before. They don't necessarily honor those of us who have fought against that U.S. military, whether it's National Guard, whether it's police, whether it's whether it's marshals or whomever. But there are those of us alive still today that are veterans of that war against the United States or Canada. And certainly honoring the Crazy Horse or Sitting Bull or Red Cloud or Tecumseh or Osceola or Red Jacket or anybody who was willing to stand up to the United States, seems to me should have a higher, perhaps a higher standing than those who just, submitted themselves to the military industrial complex of the United States. Because make no mistake about it, the United States has been guilty of genocide against our people, but has also played a major role in the death and destruction. I just saw in fact, I reposted a picture. There was a big mural down in New York City, right in the theater district, and the hashtag on this mural said "Communism kills," and it listed how many people died under communist China rule and how many people died under the communism of the USSR, and they went right down the list. I mean, Vietnam, Korea, and even got into South America, and they listed all these millions of people who were killed. Well, but nobody's listed the millions of people who were killed in the name of Christianity or Islam or Judaism. You throw those three major religions of Abraham and think about the millions of people who have died as a result of that. It's a pretty incredible number, I'm sure. So, and for that matter, how many millions have died at the hands of democracy or in the name of democracy or spreading democracy or stopping communism? Let's not forget the United States dropped nuclear weapons on civilians in Japan. I mean, that's just a matter of fact. That's not, that's not an opinion here. And they dropped them on cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They weren't that wasn't Hiroshima military base and Nagasaki military base. Those were major cities of Japan, a small island country, who, when that country bombed the United States, didn't actually even bomb the United States. It bombed a military base on unlawfully occupied territories in Hawaii. So, I mean, it's, when you kind of stack things up against each other, you realize, when people talk about asymmetric warfare, well, yeah, there's a little bit of, distinction in how these Christian nations of Europe use the sword versus the pagans that they sought to destroy. So, look, I just think that it's important that as we try to maintain our identity and try to assert an identity and protect and project an identity, we don't get it so convoluted that we continue what I call the cognitive dissonance of assimilation. And and again, I know that's a big a big set of words there. And cognitive dissonance is this idea that we struggle with some of the core values that we hold against evidence that suggests those core values are wrong, or core values that we try to hold on to, yet stand in stark conflict with the actual behaviors of our lives. And I think that's where we are. We understand as Native people that sovereignty, and this goes in any territory, even the most BIA-oriented Native territories out west or in the plains. I mean, if you talk to the grassroots people, the rank and file people of any Native territory, they'll talk to you about the strong ideology they hold towards their autonomy and their distinction and their sovereignty. But if you talk to tribal leadership and the ones who are administering policy on a Native territory, look, Standing Rock Sioux, they had a whole circle of American flags flying at their headquarters there. A whole circle of American flags. One wasn't even enough. At least down here in Seneca territory, there's only one American flag flying in front of the administration building. Of course, there's an American flag flying in front of the library. There's an American flag flying in front of the Legion. There's an American flag flying in front of the fire department. There's an American flag flying at the roundabout. There's American flags all over the place, and the Seneca Nation is responsible for flying many of them. More often than not, they've got a Seneca flag flying as well. But again, there's a certain element of that cognitive dissonance. The irony is, the flag behind me, many people are afraid of it. They think, oh, it represents violence. Well, what the hell do you think the American flag's represented? In the history of the United States, only 23 years of the United States' existence were peacetime. Only 23 years of the history of the United States was the United States not at war in some manner or another. I mean, that's a pretty incredible statistic. But I think, again, without sounding like I'm just American bashing or bashing military or bashing religion, what I'm suggesting is that when we want to look into our past, even as we try to understand our culture, if we frame our culture as Red Jacket did in his speech, although, again, I want people to understand that when Red Jacket said to those missionaries, we have our own religion, he was using their words for them. That may not have been the way that we characterize it. I mean, we use words like the Creator all the time. In the language, what we would talk about is that great natural power, meaning the power of creation, or we sometimes refer to it as the great mystery, what would translate to this great mystery. This idea of not only personifying the power of creation by calling that power a god or a creator. Now, keep in mind, God is a male, is gender specific, and creator, when spelled with O-R, is gender specific too. So that's more of an example of adopting this male dominance Christian nation of Europe concept and applying it to our culture. And I think within language, we can move prior to that becoming the way that we reference things and understanding a greater sense of equality, of a better understanding of where the emphasis needs to be, even with things like creation. When we do the Ohunda Goriyodekwa, when we do the Ganonyog, what we're talking about is creation and our relationship in that life, that the planet and the stars and the cosmos. Understanding all that, it is not necessarily a prayer to a god. We do that for the people in attendance. I mean, that's why when we open up a meeting, the first thing we do as a part of that opening is greet the people there. That's the whole purpose. The whole purpose is to get ourselves prepared to bring our minds together by mentioning the very things that we think are undeniable and that we all can agree upon. Our relationship with creation, with the earth that we walk upon, with the stars above us, with the power of creation, the plants, the animals, the winds, the thunder, the water, all of that. So we do that so we can not just prepare our minds to agree, to problem solve as a group, or to celebrate as a group. Because we do that opening in times of celebration, celebratory gatherings as well. So we do that not as a prayer to a higher being, but to acknowledge our place within creation itself. Understanding that, again, as it was explained to me, we'll not know the name or the face or the place that the power dwells, but we'll see the evidence of that power. That is the critical thinking, because to see that evidence means you have to visualize it. You have to lay your eyes upon it. You have to feel it. You have to touch it. You have to taste it. And then in doing so, now you've gained knowledge about creation, not just what you're told about where the origins. I mean, we most religions are obsessed with this notion of the origins of life, the origins of creation. I mean, we get into this battle about where we're going to teach the origins of the universe, that we have to teach creationism. And that's a real word, creationism, that we have to, talk about how it was created by something or someone. And so, of course, the natural deduction is that there's a God, there is a creator, a powerful being that created us. And that's not what our culture teaches us. We have stories about creation so we can wrap our heads around it. But what our culture teaches us is to acknowledge that power of creation by appreciating the evidence of that power. That's what we're taught. So, again, I wanted to utilize this space here, this show today, to talk about understanding the difference between the path that was laid down, that our ancestors followed, that was a consistent and that had continuity as a distinct people, versus some of the decisions that some of those folks who came before us, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, going back perhaps as long as 7 generations back, versus the decisions that they made to survive or to maintain, their well-being and their dignity, perhaps. Because after you have to understand, there was a high level of racism and oppression that our people faced, even as they tried to maintain that distinction. One of the reasons that you only have to go back a generation or two to where our own people, our parents and our grandparents, didn't pass on the language to the next generation was their sense that maintaining some of that distinction in terms of maintaining a language might be an obstacle for us. That goes along with when I say, lies my ancestors told me. I think that was a bad decision. And and obviously we all agree it was a bad decision. That's why we have language programs trying to restore the language. Because only going back a generation or two, we realized that was a bad decision made. So, I mean, we can acknowledge that about certain aspects of our lives and our history, but there are many that we don't. And I think this has to be part of that discussion. So that's what I wanted to present here today. I appreciate you listening, and again, even if you don't agree with necessarily what I said, what I've said here tonight, this is part of a discussion I think needs to be had. And it has to be, we have to really decide what it is that we want to take from our parents and our grandparents to move us forward as a distinct people versus the stuff that the decisions, whether it's how they earned a living or, how they got through, dealing with their own cognitive dissonance, I guess. That's what we have to, I think that's what we have to assess, I think, going forward. So that's why I wanted to present the topic tonight. So I want to thank you for listening and thank you for being a part of the show. And we'll be back on Monday with something else to discuss. I'm John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.
I've got just enough bread to keep above the water, and just enough fight to keep from tapping out. I've got just enough fame to get my face on the cover, but it's the cover of the Slammer